The chains were warm. That was the first wrong thing. Iron should be cold, especially in a cellar that smelled of wet stone and old wine, but the manacles at her wrists held a low heat, the kind that came from something other than skin. She did not move. Moving made the wood overhead creak, and creaking brought feet, and feet meant questions she had no good answers for. Upstairs, a fiddle was playing. Upstairs, her sister was being married. She had counted the hours by the music. 3 songs for the toasts, 1 long silence for the vows. Now this, something fast, joyful, the kind of tune meant for a bride spinning in borrowed candlelight. She pressed her forehead to her knees and let the sound move through her like something swallowed wrong. She did not cry. She had promised herself, 3 winters ago, that she was done giving anyone the satisfaction. Her name was Ronan's secret before it was ever spoken aloud in that house, though she didn't know that yet. What she knew was this. Her name was Ren, and she had been small enough, quiet enough, useful enough to disappear into the seams of her own family's house. She knew which floorboard outside the kitchen groaned and which didn't. She knew the exact moment the cook turned her back to skim cream for herself, and never told. She knew, with the precision of someone who had survived by knowing, that her stepmother counted the silver spoons every 3rd night, and that on the 2nd night, nothing was missed. She had made herself necessary and invisible at once. It was the only kind of safety this house had ever offered her. The manor sat at the edge of Blackmere territory, close enough to the wolves' lands that the servants crossed themselves at the howling, far enough that the lords of the house pretended they didn't hear it. Ren's father had married up once, to her mother, and then married up again after her mother died, to a woman with sharper eyes and a daughter of her own, ustled, golden-haired, golden-voiced, golden in every way that mattered to people who measured worth in candlelight. Ren had learned to move through rooms like whether no one noticed. She refilled cups before they were empty. She mended hems before anyone saw the tear. She had become, in the careful architecture of her own survival, someone who watched everything and asked for nothing. She was watching now, the night the King of Blackmere came to inspect the bride his court had arranged for him. He arrived without fanfare, which unsettled the house more than fanfare would have. No horns, no banners. Just the sudden, total silence of dogs that had been barking a moment before, and then a man crossing the threshold like the cold had walked in wearing a body. Ronan Vane filled the doorway without seeming to try. He was not tall in the way songs exaggerated. He was tall in the way that made a ceiling feel lower, a room feel smaller, the air feel like it had agreed to make room for him before he asked. His hair was dark and damp from the ride. His jaw held a tension that didn't ease even when he inclined his head to her father in something like courtesy. His voice, when it came, was quiet. Quiet in the particular way of men who had never needed to raise it to be obeyed. "I was told there were 2 daughters," he said. Ren, refilling a cup 3 feet away, did not look up. But something in her chest went very still, the way it had the one time, years ago, she'd stood at a cliff's edge and felt the wind tell her exactly how far down the fall would be. "There's only one daughter who matters tonight," her stepmother said smoothly, and Ussold laughed, bright, practiced, lovely, and the king's attention moved on the way attention does when it has been told where to look. But it came back. Ren felt it before she saw it, the particular weight of being watched by someone who did not blink first. She set the pitcher down with a precision that cost her more effort than it should have, and when she finally lifted her eyes, the King of Blackmere was looking at her the way a man looks at a door he hadn't noticed was unlocked. "You," he said. "What do they call you?" "Ren, my lord." Her voice came out level. She was proud of that distantly, the way you're proud of a hand that doesn't shake while everything underneath it is shaking. "Ren," he repeated, like he was testing the weight of it. Something moved behind his eyes, not interest, not yet, something colder and more clinical. Recognition without context. A man noticing a key before he knows which lock it fits. Her stepmother's voice cut in too quickly. "She is staff, my lord. Forgive her forwardness." "I asked her a question," Ronan said, without looking away from Ren. She answered it. The room recalibrated around that sentence. Wren felt it happen, the subtle redistribution of attention, the way Usold's smile thinned by a degree no one else would have caught. She had spent her whole life reading rooms for the smell of danger before it arrived. This was danger. She just didn't yet know its shape. "My lord is generous to notice the help," her stepmother said, and steered him toward the wine, toward Usold, toward the version of the evening that had been planned for weeks. Wren watched him go. She told herself the unsteady thing in her chest was relief. It was not relief. The contract was signed before the soup course. Wren learned this the way she learned most things in that house. From the doorway, from the dark, from being furniture no one thought to lower their voice around. "The girl," her stepmother said to her father, later, low, urgent, "has his attention, Edric. It's a complication. We didn't account for a complication." "Usold signed the betrothal," her father said. He sounded tired in the specific way of men who had stopped fighting their wives years ago. "It's done. Done is not the same as safe." Wren, pressed flat against the wall outside the study, felt the cold of the stones seep through her dress and did not move. She had learned the rhythm of these conversations the way sailors learn weather. This one had a different rhythm. This one had teeth in it. She did not yet understand why a king's idle glance across a dinner table would frighten a woman as composed as her stepmother. She would understand within the week. When the truce broke and Blackmere's enemies came riding through the low pass, and the king of Blackmere, bound by a contract to marry a woman whose scent meant nothing to him, would stand in the manor's great hall and announce in a voice gone low and strain that he could not complete the binding ceremony, because the binding required a mate, and a mate among his kind was not chosen. A mate was recognized by scent, by blood, by some old magic neither science nor decree could overwrite. And he had recognized her in the doorway, 3 feet from a wine pitcher, in a dress with a mendied hem. "There's been a mistake," he said, 2 nights later, finding her in the kitchen courtyard where she scrubbed pots in the dark, because the dark was the only privacy this house gave her. She did not startle, though she should have. She had heard him cross the yard, heavy boots, unhurried, deliberate, a man who had never needed to sneak anywhere in his life. "My lord," she said, not turning. "Look at me. I'm working. Wren." Her name, again, in that voice that made it sound like something he was deciding whether to keep. "Look at me." She turned. He stood with his arms loose at his sides, which she understood, somehow, in the wordless grammar bodies speak before minds catch up, was him trying to look harmless. It did not work. Nothing about him would ever look harmless. But the attempt mattered, and she filed that away without deciding why. "You're frightened," he said. "I'm careful," she corrected. "There's a difference." Something shifted in his jaw, small, contained, the kind of reaction a man has when he's been corrected and finds, against his better judgment, that he likes it. "Careful," he repeated. "Of me. Of everyone, my lord. It's served me well so far." "Has it?" He said it flatly, not as a question, and his eyes moved once over the cut on her knuckle, the strain in her shoulders, the way she'd angled her body slightly toward the door without seeming to. He read her the way she read rooms. It was the first time in her life someone had looked at her that closely and she had not been able to look away first. "I'm to marry your sister," he said. "I know. My court tells me it's already signed. I know that too. And yet." He took one step closer, and the courtyard seemed to shrink around the movement. "Here we are." She made herself hold still. "Here you are, my lord. I'm simply scrubbing pots." The corner of his mouth did something that was not quite a smile. "You say my lord like you're closing a door." "It's the only door I have." That landed somewhere in him. She watched it land, watched something flicker and steady behind his expression, the careful rearranging of a man recalculating a problem he thought he understood. "What do you want, Wren? Truly, not what you've been taught to want." No one had ever asked her that. Not once, not in 19 years, not even in the privacy of her own head, because wanting things in that house had always been a luxury reserved for daughters who weren't her. "I want," she said slowly, surprising herself with how steady it came out, "to stop being the answer to a question no one asked me." Something moved in his expression, unguarded, brief, gone almost before she registered it. "That makes two of us," he said low. A door opened somewhere in the house behind them, spilling lamplight and her stepmother's voice calling for the king. He held Wren's gaze one beat longer than courtesy required, then turned without another word, and the cold he left behind felt, absurdly, like the room had been warmer with him in it. She stood alone in the dark a long time after, scrubbing a pot that was already clean. The midpoint came on a night thick with rain, when Usseld's maid found the cellar key in Wren's apron and dragged her, soaked and silent, before the household. "She steals," Usseld said, holding up a bracelet, Wren's mother's bracelet, the only thing of her mother's she'd kept, as though it were stolen property and not the one inheritance no one had bothered to take from her yet. "She's been stealing from this house for years." "It was my mother's," Wren said, and hated how thin her voice sounded. "Your mother," her stepmother said, "left nothing. You came into this house with nothing." Her eyes were flat, final. "Take her to the cellar until she learns honesty." It was not about the bracelet. Wren understood that even as the hands closed on her arms, understood, in the cold, clear way fear sometimes sharpens you, that this was about a king's eyes lingering too long in a courtyard, about a marriage contract suddenly shadowed by something none of them could control. They could not undo the recognition, so they tried to bury the girl it had landed on. She did not fight them down the stairs. Fighting cost more than it bought in a house like this. She did not expect the door to open again before dawn. "Get up." Ronan's voice, low, urgent, stripped of every careful formality he'd worn at dinner. He had a key that should not have existed, taken, she'd learn, from a steward whose loyalty to the house had just become considerably more expensive to keep. "You shouldn't be here," she said, even as she let him pull her to her feet. "If they see, let them see." His hand at her wrist was not gentle, exactly, but it was careful, the grip of a man who knew precisely how much pressure something could bear and refused to test the limit. "I am not marrying a woman whose family chains her sister in a cellar." "You don't know what that costs you." "I know exactly what it costs me." He said it without flinching, reputation, alliance, the careful architecture of a truce he'd spent 2 years building. "I'm choosing it anyway." He didn't explain why, she didn't ask. There would be time later for the question that was already forming behind her ribs, the one with teeth. Why does a king burn down his own arrangement for a girl who scrubs pots in the dark? A new voice came from the cellar stairs, a guard, broad-shouldered, openly skeptical, his hand not quite on his sword but close enough that the closeness was the point. "My lord, this isn't sanctioned." "Then I'm unsanctioning it, Bram." Ronan didn't look back. "Watch the door." "Tell no one until I say otherwise." Bram's jaw tightened, but he stepped aside. Loyalty, Wren was learning, did not always look like agreement. Sometimes it looked like a man choosing to trust a decision he didn't yet understand. Outside, the rain had thinned to mist. Ronan led her not toward the house, but away from it, toward the old gatehouse where, he said, no one would think to look. He did not let go of her wrist until they were inside, and even then his hand hovered near hers like he hadn't fully decided to stop. "They'll know it was you," she said. "I don't particularly care." "You should." She studied him in the dim light, really studied him, the tightness around his eyes that hadn't been there at dinner, the muscle working in his jaw. "You have a war to hold together, a truce that needed this marriage." "I have a recognition I can't unmake," he said, quieter now. "I tried since the moment I saw you. I am very good, Wren, at making myself want the convenient thing instead of the true one. I have done it before. I find I no longer can." It was the most he had said to her at once. It was also, she understood, the most he intended to explain. The fire in the gatehouse hearth had burned down to a low, red breathing thing by the time either of them spoke again. She sat with her knees drawn up, her mother's bracelet back on her wrist where it belonged, and watched him stare into the coals like they owed him an answer. "You're not what I expected," he said finally. "The night I met you. What did you expect?" "Someone smaller." He turned the cup in his hands without drinking from it. "Easier to overlook." "I am easy to overlook," she said. "I've had a great deal of practice at it." "Not to me." He said it simply, without performance, and something in the plainness of it undid her more than any declaration could have. I have a kingdom that watches my every breath for weakness. I have not had a quiet hour in longer than I can remember. He looked up. This is the first one. She didn't know what to do with the tenderness that statement put in her chest, so she did what she always did with feelings too large for the room. She set it aside, carefully, the way you set aside something fragile you intend to come back to. Why did you really come to the cellar? She asked. Tonight, truly. He was quiet long enough that she thought he wouldn't answer. Because I imagined you down there in the dark, and I found I could not sit upstairs and let that be true. His voice had gone rough at the edges. I don't have a better answer than that. She wanted then, with a force that frightened her, to reach for him. She had not let herself want anything that plainly in years. She didn't move. He didn't either. The wanting sat between them like a third presence in the room, patient, unclaimed. It was he who broke it, of course it was he, she would think later. He who had spent a lifetime closing doors before they could be walked through. You should sleep, he said, standing, suddenly brisk, suddenly every inch the king again. Bram will guard the door, will decide what comes next at first light. The window closed. She let it. Some doors, she understood, needed both hands to open, and neither of them was ready yet. First light brought worse than decisions. It brought riders, Marin raiders, the truce breakers from the eastern ridge, descending on the manor's outer wall with torches and a message scrawled on a banner that needed no translation. The king's mate is known. Give her to us or burn with her. Wren's stomach dropped through the floor. Known. Someone had talked. Someone, somewhere between the cellar and the dawn, had sold the one secret that might have kept her breathing. Ronan's face, when the message reached him, did not change in any way a stranger would have noticed. But Wren noticed. She had spent her life noticing. The stillness that came over him was not calm. It was a held breath, a coiled spring, violence deciding where to land. Seal the gates, he said to Bram, and his voice carried the specific, terrible quiet of a man no longer asking. Sound the horn. Every blade in this house answers to me before this hour is out. My lord, the manor isn't fortified for. Then we fortify it. He turned, and for 1/2 second his eyes found Wren's across the chaos of the yard, and the fear in his face was not for himself. Get her inside. My word, my seal, my name on it. Anyone who touches her answers to the crown of Blackmere directly. It was the first time anyone had put a king's whole authority between her and harm. She felt the weight of it land somewhere unfamiliar in her chest. Not safety, exactly. Something larger than safety. Something with her name attached to consequences for the first time in her life. The fight that followed was short, brutal, and entirely his. She watched from the gatehouse window as he moved through the yard like something the raiders hadn't accounted for. Fast, precise, terrible, every strike economical, nothing wasted on display. He fought like a man with something to return to. When it ended, the yard was quiet in the particular way aftermath is quiet. Smoke, blood in the snow, the raiders who could still run already gone. He came to her first. Before his own wound was bound, before his guard finished securing the gate, he came to the gatehouse door and stood there, breathing hard, looking at her like he needed to confirm with his own eyes that she was unbroken. Neither of them said anything. They didn't need to. The room between them had changed shape, and they both knew it, and neither one moved to name it yet. Why did you do it? She asked him that night, when the manor had gone still and the only sound was the wind testing the shutters. Put your name on me, in front of everyone. You could have handled it quietly. He considered the question longer than she expected. Because quiet has never once kept anyone I loved safe, he said. And I find I am done pretending caution is the same thing as care. That's not really an answer. No, he agreed. It isn't. She waited. He looked at the fire, not at her, which told her more than his face would have. I helped you, he said finally, because the moment I saw you, something in me stopped negotiating with the rest of my life. I don't know how to explain a recognition to someone who hasn't felt one. I only know that I would burn the truce, the throne, and my own name to the ground before I'd let them put you back in that cellar. It was, she would think later, the best and worst sentence anyone had ever said to her, too large to hold, too honest to argue with. That's the kind of thing, she said quietly, a person could get hurt believing. Then don't believe it, he said. Just let it be true. She did not answer that. She let the silence hold it instead, and he did not push further, and the night closed gently around the unfinished space between them. The wedding, the real one her stepmother had spent months engineering, collapsed within the week, not from scandal, but from something older and stranger than scandal. The contract itself had been written under moon law, binding two houses through a goddess's old rites. And when Ronan stood before the assembled court and refused to complete a binding his blood would not honor, the sky itself seemed to take notice. It happened at dusk, in the chapel courtyard, with Usold in her bridal gold and Wren standing at the edge of the gathered crowd, where she had always stood. The moon rose early and full and far too bright, and the air went thin and cold in a way no season explained. Her stepmother's voice, raised in fury, cracked the courtyard's silence. Accusations, threats, the old practiced cruelty dressed up as righteousness. And then it stopped, mid-word, because the light above them had changed. It was Wren who felt it first, a pull low in her chest, old and patient, like something that had been wading through every cellar, every cruelty, every quiet swallowed insult, finally deciding she had waited long enough. The moonlight did not simply fall. It gathered, deliberate, unhurried, the way only something with intention moves. The voice that came was not loud. It did not need to be. You bound what was never yours to bind, it said, and the words did not pass through ears so much as through bone. You sold a daughter's freedom to buy a crown's comfort. The debt is owed. The debt is called. Wren's stepmother went the color of old ash. Usold did not move at all. And Ronan crossed the courtyard without hesitation, without ceremony, and put himself at Wren's side as though the question of where he belonged had never once been in doubt. The curse, when it came, was not fire or lightning. It was quieter and worse. The bloodline that had built its comfort on a stolen girl's silence found, from that night on, that nothing they built would hold. Wealth slipped through their hands like water through a closed fist. Alliances soured at the signing table. The house that had measured worth in candlelight found itself, slowly and without spectacle, going dark. Wren felt no triumph watching it, only a long, tired exhale, the kind that comes after years of carrying something too heavy to name. "Why did you stay?" she asked him much later, when the courtyard had emptied and the moon had settled back into something ordinary and far away. Through all of it, you could have let the contract stand, let the goddess sort it out from a safer distance. Ronan looked at her for a long moment before he answered, and when he did, his voice had none of its usual careful weight. "Because the first time I saw you, you were pouring wine like the room owed you nothing," he said. "And I have spent every day since wanting to be a man worth your noticing." It was, she thought, the kind of line she would carry the rest of her life, short, plain, unbearably true. She did not answer with words. She let her hand find his, certain and unhurried, and that was answer enough. Spring came to Blackmere the way it always had, slow. Then suddenly, snow giving up its grip on the hills in a single warm week. Wren stood in the same courtyard, where the moon had once spoken her name like a debt finally collected. Except now the stones were warm under her bare feet, and the only sound was a fiddle, somewhere inside, tuning itself for an entirely different kind of music. "You're early," Ronan said, coming to stand beside her, his crown left somewhere inside because he hated the weight of it on days that didn't require performance. "I wanted to see it in daylight," she said, "the place where it happened." He followed her gaze to the worn stone where she'd once stood frozen in fear, waiting for a voice from the sky to decide her fate. "Does it still feel heavy?" She considered the question honestly, the way she considered everything now, without the old reflex to hide the true answer behind a careful one. "No," she said. "It feels like a door I finally walked all the way through." He took her hand, the gesture unhurried, certain, the same quality of touch he'd used the night he pulled her from the cellar, like he knew exactly how much weight a thing could bear and never once tested past it. "Come inside," he said. "They're waiting to start without you." She let him lead her toward the music, toward the warmth, toward a life she had never once let herself imagine wanting. She was still smiling when the doors closed behind them.